morning. So today we're beginning modernism, which is primarily the early 1900s, although we have some that run a little later and some that run a little bit earlier. Now, what we're looking at today are folks who are really preoccupied with the idea of making things new. All of a sudden, instead of completely imitating Greeks and Romans in one of 1 million different forms, we're throwing it all out in the name of technology because we're sick of competing with camera and film, and we're looking for something new and revolutionary to go with this new revolutionary world. Our Impressionists and our Post-Impressionists were a good bridge, our Secessionists, but all of a sudden, it's not enough to just tap at those boundaries. They're getting a good hard shove. So this is what we call modernism with a capital M. One of the things you're going to notice is a big step in art towards abstraction. Remember, abstraction means that we're not looking at a picture and going, it's a horse. You're going, it could be a horse. Because abstraction's got a completely different intention. And part of this is because with the new emphasis on psychoanalysis that came at the end of the 1800s from Freud, you have a new focus on the subconscious mind. You have a new sense of stepping away from realism and what it can get you from the folks we talked about in previous lectures. And last but not least, we have a new Western interest in non-Western art. Yeah, it only took 400 years. So the 1800s were the period of the Victorians, and the Victorians were, instead of destroying art as inferior or tainted by religions they didn't understand, they started collecting art from non-Western countries as what we would call scientific specimens. This is pretty creepy and condescending, and that art wasn't always designed to be seen in public. In some cases, they represented sacred rituals that were not supposed to be oohed and awed at by any old person who paid admission to a museum. But as painful as some of that art taken in conquest and often deliberately looted is, it provided a chance for a number of Western artists suddenly to look at that art, and when they looked at it long enough, they finally began to realize that there were incredible lessons they should learn from art from other nations. Again, it only took a couple hundred years, cough, cough, but they're making it there, slowly. Not a lot of knowledge about what its symbolism means, what its purpose is in the societies it's taken from, but we're at least coming to an appreciation of design qualities. Baby steps. One example of an artist who becomes really big in the early 20th century, incredibly popular actually in the 1920s, is Maria Martinez. And she worked for part of her career independently. Then her husband, Julian, helped her to design some of these pots. And after his death, she worked with her son and daughter-in-law. But Martinez pioneers a form of Pueblo pottery that, instead of just having the incredibly beautiful glossy black finish that you see here, had black on black designs with a black mat, creating designs over that glossier black. And this is what she becomes absolutely famous for, and these become collector pieces. This is a big deal because, first of all, it's showing a new appreciation for indigenous pottery in North America, which depressingly hadn't really existed before the early 20th century. And even more important, Maria Martinez and her family members are actually recognized as artists. This is not seen as something that's a scientific specimen of another culture. This is actually just seen as a really beautiful piece of design. And so Maria Martinez, incredible groundbreaking pottery and appreciation of that. Notice the geometric patterns. Sometimes these have figures like a water dragon that shoots lightning. Sometimes you'll see feathers, and sometimes just more general geometric shapes. If some indigenous artists in the Americas were starting to get individual recognition and have their pieces collected by prominent galleries, we see a lot less of that recognition of artists from outside the Americas. So when we look, for example, at African art, we usually have no idea who the artist is. We often are vague on what the purpose of even the art was, and we have a vague idea of the culture, but often not which country on a modern map it comes from. So this is a wonderful example from the Met Museum. This is Nkizi Nkondi, the mangaka. This is a figure that has, you can see, nails driven into it. And the figure is from Central Africa, and it's a power figure that we know is usually built by artists with input from the Congo nation's spiritual leaders. And this represents a judge or a lawmaker. Today we know that because we can see his mpu headdress, which lets him know how important he is. And we think that medicine was actually stored in the center where that hole in his stomach is. The nails would have marked important treaties or ceremonies, rites of passage in the community, but there's also a strong tradition of driving nails into the figure to sort of prod that power figure to influence the community for the better. Now, we know this from various other examples of power figures like this in Nkizi Nkondi. But one of the depressing things is we can't tell you even which area of Central Africa this comes from, because the Victorians are literally grabbing and running. Once again, we have slightly more better information about North American indigenous artists. So this is Andrew Mamgark, who's an Inuit artist from north of the United States. This is a slightly later piece because the Inuit pieces become popular slightly later, but we do know that artist's name. This is an image of mother and child, and you can see how important this is going to be in terms of shaping slightly more abstract culture of art. The incredible simplicity of the lines, the real basic shapes, and yet how well they convey emotion is the sort of thing that European and white American artists are seeing and having their minds blown when they finally start paying attention to art from around them by other cultures. The same way when we looked at the Nkizi Nkondi, those shapes of the eyes, the elongated shape of the face, the basic shape of the posture. This is simplified lines, but the simplified lines are so powerful. We see the power of line and shape in design one more time with the Dogon mask from the 20th century. This is an antelope. Notice that the museum that holds it hasn't even managed to put a color photo of it up yet. But we do know the antelope mask has real simple horns, real simple rectangle for that elongated face of the antelope. And again, those clean lines are so expressive compared to, say, a Delacroix painting where you have to go over the top, or a Canova sculpture where everything's got to look like it's Roman. And that's really impacting people. Now, it would be nicer if they knew when exactly this was made, what its purpose was, why the antelope mattered, who the artists are in the community, but that was not the style of collecting during this period. So although this new appreciation for non-Western art by Westerners is shifting the art world dramatically, it's still comes from a pretty creepy piece of conquest. It's also a reminder that really when we study art history, we're talking about looking at art from a Western perspective, which is highly problematic. Here we have an equestrian figure, so individual on horseback from Ghana that's now in the US. Again, I'm hoping you're noticing those clarified simple lines. We see a similar figure from Indonesia. And with all of these, unlike a painting that you can look up from, say, the 1700s in Europe, where you will find pages of art historical essays, we find very little. This art continues to be understudied to this day. And while we have an idea of what Westerners make of this art, we don't have an idea of what these artists would have made of Western art. The dialogue is not so good at back and forth. There's not the sort of reciprocity that would ideally have existed. I want you to pay particular attention here to the painting from Papua New Guinea. One of the things we see in some of the Polynesian art and into Australian art, these real fine details. Here, these are real fine white lines being painted, but when we get into things like Indigenous art in Australia, you'll see lots of very fine dot paintings. And this extraordinary eye for detail reminds us almost of the pointillistes. There could have been incredible communication there, but instead, there would literally be groups of museum curators sent out to just take whatever they could get for trading. And we don't often have a sense of who the individual picture is meant to be, or how these techniques are learned, what they're inspired by. I could go on for a while. So one of the last examples we're going to look at is a mask from Angola. And this is the Holo people of Angola. And the mask, again, has such clear, effective lines. If the painting above from Papua New Guinea was a mastery of color, this is a fabulous mastery of form. It conveys an incredible emotion, the eyes, the mouth, the shape of the jaw, with very little. And that sort of minimalism is very attractive to Europeans who were so used to going completely over the top after things like Romanticism. And all of a sudden, it's going to inspire them. Now, again, it would be nice if we knew how the mask was created, why the mask was created, who created it. Often, we don't have anything more than a rough century and a guess of which country this got taken from. But it's going to have an impact, and at least we're pushing further towards dialogue. In addition to looking at Indigenous and non-Western artists, we're going to see a new appreciation for what we call self-taught artists. So in Europe, at a time when being part of one of these grand academies or being part of a group that's studied in art school and then breaks away and does wild stuff like the secessionists, it's considered elite and necessary. Self-taught, we would probably call these also folk artists, are all of a sudden getting new appreciation because their emotional engagement with their work is seen by some as pure. Some people look at these paintings and say, oh, they're rubbish. No perspective, no depth, no shading compared to artists who've been taught better. Others look at it and say, but they capture something without being too studied. They don't try as hard, so it feels refreshing. One of the ultimate examples of these, who hung around Paris, actually with Picasso among other people, was a man who worked actually as a customs agent, Henri Rousseau. And he did a number of paintings that show everyday life in France. One of my favorites here is the football players, and you can see how awkward and jerky their movements are. This is not a guy who's taken elaborate anatomy classes as an art academy. However, I think there's something kind of crazy, charming, and adorable about these men in their little stripy suits and their mustaches. Rousseau's especially famous for doing a number of these paintings that show jungle scenes. This is probably inspired by news about the French occupation of Indochina, as it was known at the time. Today we would say Vietnam and Cambodia. But Henri Rousseau never went there. So this is his imagination. Notice he's got a lion eating what presumably is a leopard, but I suppose could be a cheetah. I don't know how much you've thought about lions, but lions from the savannah don't hang out in the jungle where there are banana trees. Think about that for a minute. That being said, he's got really interesting things going on with the cutout of the leaves and the play with proportion so that these look almost like big paper applique pieces. And I think that's why people enjoy them in spite of the fact that he's not exactly winning a special on the Nature Channel anytime soon. We come back, we're going to talk about what European artists do with this new exposure that they're actually beginning to appreciate to non-Western and indigenous art and more folk art.